Until recently, I lived with my parents in a small, weathered house on the edge of Black Hollow, a quiet town nestled deep in the pine forests of the Pacific Northwest. The town was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, but no one really knew each other. It was surrounded by dense woods, and the air always carried the faint scent of damp earth and pine needles. My parents were stern and reclusive, so we rarely had visitors. The only exception was my best friend, Ethan Carter. We'd known each other since kindergarten, and he was the one person I could always count on. While my parents were quick to scold me for my mistakes, Ethan was the kind of guy who'd roll up his sleeves and help you fix them. He'd been through a lot, growing up without a father, working odd jobs since he was 14, and still managing to keep his sense of humor intact. I admired him, even if I was a little jealous of how effortlessly he seemed to navigate life. Ethan's mother had passed away a year after he turned 18, leaving him her small apartment in Ravenwood Heights, a crumbling complex on the outskirts of town. The place had seen better days, but it was his. A week ago, Ethan came over to my house late in the evening. My parents were at a community theater performance, so we had the place to ourselves for a few hours. We didn't throw a party, my parents would have killed me, but we did talk about my future. "You should buy a place," Ethan said, leaning back on the couch. "Something cheap, just to get your foot in the door." I laughed. "With what money? My savings?" "Exactly," he replied, grinning. "I've got an idea." He told me about Willowbrook Apartments, a rundown building on the edge of town. It had been condemned due to a massive crack in the foundation, and the residents were being relocated to new housing. Ethan's plan was simple: buy one of the cheap, condemned units, live there for a few weeks, and then get a free new apartment when the building was demolished. At first, I thought he was crazy, but after a long conversation with my parents, who seemed more eager to get me out of the house than to argue, I agreed. The next day, Ethan showed me a listing he'd found online. The seller was a guy named Jake Miller, who'd inherited the apartment from his grandmother. He had no attachment to the place and was eager to sell. The apartment was on the 4th floor of Willowbrook. The steel door stood out against the peeling, graffiti-covered walls, but the inside was worse. The air smelled damp and musty, like a basement that hadn't been aired out in decades. The wallpaper was peeling, the kitchen window was cracked, and the only light in the hallway came from a single, flickering bulb. The living room had an old TV and a couch where Jake's grandmother had passed away. We covered it with a sheet, not because we were superstitious, but because sitting where someone had died felt wrong. The second room had a bed, a wardrobe, and a nightstand. "It's livable," Ethan said with a grin. "Barely," I muttered, but I couldn't help smiling. That night, I moved in. Around dusk, I met my neighbor, Maggie Sullivan, a middle-aged woman with a raspy voice and a cigarette permanently glued to her fingers. She'd lived in Willowbrook her whole life and wasn't thrilled about the relocation. "They'll shove us into some crappy dormitory," she said bitterly. "I'd rather live in this dump than some sterile box." Later, I met Walter Hargrove, an elderly man who lived upstairs. He was tall and gaunt, with a military posture that hinted at a past life in the service. But his eyes were haunted and his voice trembled when he spoke. "Don't open the door at night," he warned me. I didn't think much of it at the time. That night, I was woken by loud thuds from upstairs. It sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor, followed by heavy footsteps and the sound of glass breaking. I banged on the radiator and the noise stopped. The next morning, Maggie told me she'd seen a light turn on and off in her apartment while she was outside. I offered to check but found nothing. Later that night, I heard a woman scream. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, Maggie was dead. There were no visible wounds, just blood from her mouth and broken nails, as if she'd fought someone. The police suspected the killer had escaped through the attic. I spent the night at Ethan's place, but the noises from upstairs continued. The next day I reported Walter to the police. When they broke into his apartment, they found him dead in his chair, surrounded by his own hair and bloodied glass shards. The coroner estimated he'd been dead for at least 3 days. I moved in with Ethan and waited for the building to be demolished. One evening, as we approached Willowbrook to retrieve my belongings, I saw the light in my apartment flicker on and off. I screamed at everyone to leave. Now I live with Ethan, waiting for the building to be torn down. Recently, I noticed a missed call from my old apartment's landline. I threw away my phone and SIM card. That place isn't my problem anymore.